Kansas, 1883. Silas Cole had built things his whole working life and trusted almost none of them. He had framed barns in Missouri, raised grain silos in Nebraska, set fence posts across half the Plain States, and left every single job the day it was finished because staying meant someone might ask him to build something that mattered. And Silas had stopped trusting himself with anything that mattered 18 months ago. He rode into Larkin County on a gray October morning with $2, a bag of tools, and a silence he'd been carrying since Missouri that he had no intention of setting down. He had spent the 18 months since Missouri moving in a rough circle across 4 states, never staying anywhere longer than a job required, never taking work that asked him to build something permanent. Fence repair suited him fine. A fence was honest. It told you plainly when it had failed, and it forgave you for fixing it imperfectly, which was more grace than Silas felt he'd earned in a long while. He'd worked cattle pens in Nebraska, mended grain elevators in Iowa, and turned down twice offers to foreman a proper construction crew, because a foreman's name went on the paperwork. And Silas had decided somewhere around month 4 that his name wasn't going on anything again. He found the fence before he found the woman. A quarter-mile of split-rail boundary running along a wagon road, half of it sagging, rotted, or simply gone. Wire hanging loose between the posts that remained. He reined in his horse and sat looking at it a long moment, the particular kind of disrepair that comes not from neglect, but from one person trying to hold too much together for too long alone. "Your fence is falling apart," he said, to no one, mostly to himself. "So am I," said a voice behind him. "Fix whichever one you can." If you're the kind of person who stays for stories like this one, hit subscribe before we go any further and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. I like knowing how far these evenings travel. He turned. She was standing at the gate with a hoe over one shoulder, dark circles under tired eyes. A woman who had clearly not slept enough in longer than she could probably say. 26, maybe 27, sharp-boned and steady on her feet, despite the exhaustion written plainly across her. "Eleanor Hargrove," she said. "This is my land, was my husband's. Now it's mine, such as it is." She looked at the fence the way you look at a wound you've stopped expecting to heal. "You looking for work?" "Depends what kind. The kind where I can't pay you much, and there's a great deal of it, and half of what needs fixing I don't have words left to ask for properly." She said it flatly, without self-pity, the tone of someone who had simply run out of energy for performing composure. "You handy with fence?" "I'm handy with most things I don't have to talk about while I do them." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Then we'll get along fine." She studied him a moment longer. The horse in poor condition but well cared for. The tools worn from real use rather than neglect. The particular stillness of a man who had learned to hold himself carefully. "You got a name?" "Silas Cole." "You running from something, Silas Cole?" He didn't answer right away, and she didn't press, which he noticed. "Something like that," he said finally. "Most men who come through here looking for fence work are," she said without judgment, the way you'd note the weather. "Barn's got a loft. It's dry. Supper's at 6 if you're still here by then." She turned back toward the house, then paused. "You will be, won't you?" "Still here by 6. "I expect so," Silas said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it. Eleanor Hargrove's husband Daniel had died in March, 6 months back, from a fever that started as a cut from a broken plow blade and ended 3 infected weeks later, with Eleanor bearing him on the rise behind the house and facing a harvest, a mortgage note to the Larkin County Grain Cooperative, and 400 acres entirely alone. She explained the shape of it to Silas over coffee at her kitchen table that first evening. Plainly, the way a person explains something they've had to explain to themselves too many times already to feel much when they say it out loud. The co-op held a note on seed and equipment Daniel had borrowed against the spring before he died. $60, due in full by the first snow, 6 weeks out. The wheat was in, but she'd need help getting it to the mill before the roads turned, and the fence needed to hold through winter, or the cattle would scatter across 3 counties by January. "I can pay you $8 for 6 weeks and a place in the barn loft," she said. "It's not much." "It's fair," Silas said. "I've worked for less and worse company." She almost smiled again. "We'll see how long that opinion holds." She pulled out a small ledger, worn soft at the corners from handling, and opened it to a page dense with her own careful figures. "Daniel kept the books loose," she said. "I kept them exact because somebody had to, and it turned out to be me. $60 to the co-op by first snow. 200 bushels of wheat to get to the mill before the roads freeze. A 1/4 mile of fence that's more gap than rail. 40 head of cattle that'll scatter into 3 different counties the first hard wind if that fence doesn't hold." She closed the ledger. "I've done the arithmetic every night for 2 weeks, Mr. Cole. It comes out the same every time. I can't do this alone by first snow. I could before Daniel. I can't now, and I've stopped being ashamed of saying so." "Nothing to be ashamed of in needing another set of hands," Silas said. "Only shame's in pretending you don't." She looked at him with something that might have been surprise at hearing her own thinking said back to her by a stranger. "You philosophize as much as you talk?" "Rarely do either," he said. "Made an exception." The work consumed the weeks that followed with the particular mercy of labor, the kind that doesn't leave room for a man to think too hard about what he's not saying. Silas rose before dawn and worked the fence line post by post, replacing rotted wood, restringing wire, and Eleanor worked alongside him more often than not, because there was no version of this farm's survival that didn't require both of them at everything. He noticed, the way a careful builder notices structural things, that Eleanor Hargrove ran her farm the way a person runs on willpower after the fuels run out, competent, thorough, and completely unwilling to stop long enough to feel the weight of what she was carrying. He recognized it because he'd been doing a version of the same thing since Missouri, just with a hammer instead of a hoe. "You don't talk much," she said on the 4th day, handing him a fresh coil of wire. "Not much worth saying." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her a moment. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She didn't push. That, more than anything else, was what got past his guard in the first 2 weeks. She asked questions like a person offering a door, not like a person demanding he walk through it. Their evening settled into a rhythm neither of them named out loud. Supper at 6, the 2 of them at a table built for 4. The particular ease of people who'd stopped needing to fill every silence with talk. Eleanor would go over the ledger by lamplight while Silas oiled tools or mended harness, and some nights she'd read a passage aloud from whatever book she was working through. She was, it turned out, a determined and eclectic reader, borrowing volumes from the Larkin County Lending Library 3 towns over whenever the wagon trip allowed, and Silas found himself listening more closely than he let on. "You don't strike me as a woman who grew up on a wheat farm," he said one evening, watching her mark a passage in a battered copy of a novel. "I didn't," she said. "Grew up in Topeka. My father clerked at a bank. I married Daniel at 19 because he had the kindest eyes of any man who'd ever looked at me twice, and because Topeka felt like a place where nothing was ever going to happen to me, and I wanted something to happen to me." She turned a page. "Something happened, all right." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which she seemed to understand better than words would have managed anyway. Hollis Pratt made his first visit of that autumn on a Thursday in late October, riding up the lane with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the largest operation in 3 sections and had never once had to ask for anything twice. He was 50, silver at the temples, dressed better than farm work required, with the particular smoothness of a man who'd made his money in grain futures rather than dirt. "Eleanor," he said, tipping his hat, eyes moving briefly, assessingly, to Silas mending fence in the middle distance. "Heard you'd taken on help." "Heard right," Eleanor said. "Just came to see how you're managing." Winter's an unkind season for a farm short a man. He said it gently enough that it might have passed for genuine concern if Eleanor hadn't spent 6 months learning to hear the calculation underneath Pratt's gentleness. "We're managing fine, Hollis. The offer on the West 200 still stands, you know. Fair price. More than fair, given the circumstances." He smiled, the particular smile of a man used to being thanked for his generosity. "No shame in it, Eleanor. A woman alone." "I'm not alone," Eleanor said. "And the land's not for sale. Was Daniel's before it was mine, and it'll stay whoever's it is until I say different." She held his gaze until he looked away first. "Give my regards to the co-op board, Hollis. I hear you sit on it." Pratt's smile thinned by a fraction before he recovered it. "That I do." He tipped his hat again and rode off without further pleasantries, and Eleanor stood watching him go with her jaw set in a way Silas was beginning to recognize as her particular flavor of quiet fury. "Friend of yours?" Silas asked, coming up the lane with a coil of wire over his shoulder. "Wolf in a banker's coat," Eleanor said. "He's been circling since the funeral. Made his first offer before Daniel was 6 weeks in the ground." She shook her head. "Man thinks patience is the same thing as decency. It isn't." The trouble arrived in layers, the way trouble does on a farm running on nothing but momentum. First, the co-op's note came due 2 weeks early. A clerical error, the manager claimed, though Eleanor suspected otherwise, given that Hollis Pratt, who owned the neighboring section and had made 2 quiet offers on her land since Daniel's funeral, sat on the co-op's board and had every reason to want her short on time. "He's not going to get this land," Eleanor said, staring at the notice on her kitchen table. "Not because I'm sentimental about it. Because Daniel and I broke every acre of it ourselves, and I'm not handing 4 years of work to a man who spent 6 months waiting for me to be tired enough to sell." "Are you tired enough?" Silas asked. "Every single day," she said. "Doesn't mean I'm selling." They brought the wheat to the mill 3 days ahead of the note's deadline, Silas driving the wagon while Eleanor rode beside him with the ledger in her lap, both of them saying very little, the particular quiet of 2 people working toward the same narrow window of survival. The mill weighed the grain, paid out, and Eleanor rode straight to the co-op office and settled the note in full, $60 counted out onto Hollis Pratt's own desk, while he watched with the flat expression of a man recalculating a plan that had just failed. "Didn't expect you'd manage it," Pratt said. "I expect you didn't," Eleanor said, and walked out. I want to pause here a moment because this is the part of Eleanor's story that stays with me. She wasn't fighting for a fortune. She was fighting to keep the specific, unglamorous proof of 4 years spent building something with a man she loved. Proof that would mean nothing to anyone else and meant everything to her. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing, most of the time. Now let's get back to Larkin County because settling one debt doesn't fix a fence, and winter doesn't wait for anybody's paperwork. The first hard freeze came in mid-November. 3 weeks ahead of the almanac's prediction, and brought with it a wind that found every remaining weak point in a mile of half-repaired fence line. Silas worked through it with the grim, wordless focus Eleanor had come to recognize as his version of prayer. And it was on the coldest night of that stretch, hauling a fresh post through knee-deep frozen mud toward the last unfinished section, that his own past finally caught up to him. The post shifted wrong in the half-set hole. He caught it, but the motion, the specific give of unstable ground under load, sent him somewhere else entirely. Somewhere 18 months and 400 miles away, to a barn in Missouri, where he'd miscalculated a support beam's load and watched it fail under a young apprentice named Robert Ames, who had lived but never walked the same afterward, and who Silas had left town rather than face again. Eleanor found him sitting in the frozen mud beside the half-set post, hands shaking, staring at nothing. Silas. He didn't answer. Silas. She crouched in front of him. What happened? It came out of him in pieces over the following hour, sitting in the cold, because he couldn't make himself move toward the warmth of the house until he'd said it. There was a barn outside Springfield, he said. Big operation, biggest job I'd taken on my own. I had an apprentice, Robert Ames, 19 years old, sharp kid, better with a level than I was at his age. I miscalculated a support beam. Load-bearing calculation, the kind of mistake a first-year man makes, not the kind a foreman makes. He stared at his hands in the lantern light. Beam gave out while Robert was up in the loft securing the roof joists. I was underneath. I saw it start to go and I called out, but not fast enough, or loud enough, or, I don't know, not enough of whatever it needed to be. He fell 2 stories with the beam coming down after him. Did he die? Eleanor asked quietly. No. Worse, in a way, for a man that young. Broke his back. Lived, but he'll never walk right again. Never do the kind of work he loved. And it wasn't bad luck that did it to him, Eleanor. It was my arithmetic. He shook his head slowly. I went to see him in the hospital in Springfield. Sat by his bed for an hour and couldn't say one honest word to him. Left town 2 days later and haven't stopped moving since. Eleanor was quiet a long moment, watching him with an expression that held no pity, only a kind of clear-eyed understanding. You never went back to make it right? What would right even look like? I can't give him his legs back. I can't undo the math. No, she agreed, but you could have let him see you stay and carry it instead of running from it. Some debts aren't about fixing the thing. They're about not disappearing on the person you owe. She said it gently, but it landed like a struck nail all the same. I don't build things that matter anymore, he said, because the last thing that mattered, I got wrong. Eleanor was quiet a long moment, the wind cutting across the dark field around them. This fence matters, she said finally. This whole farm matters. You've been building things that matter for 6 weeks, Silas. You just haven't let yourself notice. What if I get it wrong again? Then we fix it, she said. That's what a fence is, not something that never breaks. Something you're willing to keep fixing. She held his gaze in the cold dark. I'm not asking you to be certain. I'm asking you to keep showing up anyway. The barn's east wall came down in the same storm system a week later. Old construction, weakened by decades of Kansas wind, finally giving way in gusts that flattened half the county's outbuildings overnight. Eleanor's cattle, sheltered inside, were suddenly exposed to open, freezing weather with a collapsed wall between them and safety. Silas stood at the wreckage at 4 a.m. with the wind screaming and every instinct in him reaching for the door marked Leave, the same door he'd walked through in Missouri. The east wall had folded inward across nearly a third of the structure, splintered timber jutting at angles that made his stomach turn. The exact geometry of failure he'd spent 18 months trying not to look at directly, now lit by lantern light and howling wind, not 30 feet from where he stood frozen. Eleanor was already moving cattle through the gap toward the standing half of the barn, alone, in the dark, in weather that had killed men for less. Her voice hoarse from shouting over the wind, her hands raw from rope burn, moving with the desperate efficiency of a woman who had already decided she would rather freeze than lose what was left of this place. "Silas!" she called, spotting him standing motionless at the edge of the wreckage. "I need another set of hands or I'm going to lose 6 head before sunrise." He didn't move. His breath was coming too fast, his vision narrowing to the collapsed beam angle, to Robert Ames's scream replaying somewhere behind his eyes, to 18 months of very good reasons never to stand underneath a failing structure again. Silas. He thought about Robert Ames. He thought about 18 months of never building anything that could fail somebody who'd remember his name. Then he thought about Eleanor Hargrove moving cattle alone in a Kansas blizzard because the alternative was losing everything she had left of her husband, and he walked into the wreckage and started calculating load-bearing angles by lantern light with hands that had gone from shaking to perfectly, terribly steady. They worked until dawn, Silas directing the temporary bracing with the precision of a man who had spent 18 months punishing himself for one mistake by refusing to use the skill that mistake had come from, calling out load calculations with a steadiness that surprised even him, checking and rechecking every angle twice, 3 times, the way he hadn't allowed himself to trust his own math since Springfield. Eleanor moved cattle and hauled timber alongside him without complaint, passing him tools before he asked for them, reading his instructions half a second before he finished giving them. The two of them working as a single coordinated unit against a wind that seemed determined to take the whole structure down around them. By first light, the wall was braced, the herd was safe, and Silas Cole had built something that mattered for the first time since Missouri. With his hands shaking the whole way through and not once stopping, the temporary bracing held through the rest of the storm and would hold. He knew with the certainty of a man checking his own arithmetic against real consequences, straight through to spring, when he intended to rebuild the wall properly, permanently, correctly. Not to prove anything to Robert Ames, who couldn't see it, but because he had finally, in the worst hour of that Kansas winter, remembered what it felt like to trust his own hands again. Eleanor found him afterward, sitting against a hay bale in the gray dawn light, exhausted and hollow-eyed, and more present than she had ever seen him. "You didn't run," she said. "No," he said. "I wanted to. Every minute of it." "That's the part that counts," she said, sitting down beside him. "Not the wanting. The staying anyway." Winter settled properly after that, and with it came a different kind of quiet between them. Not the careful distance of 2 people protecting old wounds, but the easier silence of 2 people who'd already shown each other the worst of what they carried and hadn't run from it. Hollis Pratt made one final attempt in December, a formal offer delivered by letter, 30% over market value, an amount calculated to be difficult for a struggling widow to refuse. Eleanor wrote back 4 words: "The fence still holds." She had Silas deliver it personally, which he did, standing on Pratt's porch in the cold with the particular satisfaction of a man who had spent 6 weeks proving a debt could be repaid 1 post at a time. On a January evening, with the wheat money banked, the fence standing whole around every acre, and the barn's east wall rebuilt stronger than the original, Silas found Eleanor on the porch looking out at land that was, by every difficult measure, still entirely hers. "I was planning on moving on come spring," he said. "Told myself that since October." "I know," she said. "You've been telling yourself that every week you didn't leave." He almost laughed. "You keep seeing straight through me." "It's not hard," she said. "You build things carefully because you're afraid of what happens when you don't. I just had to figure out you'd stopped believing you were allowed to build something for yourself." She looked at him directly. "The fence isn't the only thing worth fixing slowly, Silas." He was quiet a moment, looking out at 400 acres of frozen Kansas ground that had somehow, without his quite meaning it to, become the first place in 18 months that felt less like a stopping point and more like an answer. "I don't know how to promise I won't get something wrong again," he said. "Nobody's asking for a promise like that," Eleanor said. "I'm asking if you'll keep showing up when you do." "Yes," he said, and meant it the way a man means a thing he has finally, after 18 months, decided he's allowed to want. They were married in March at the farmhouse itself rather than the church in town, with a handful of neighbors and Larkin County's mill manager as witness, a small, unglamorous ceremony that suited them both exactly. Silas built the wedding arch himself out of leftover fence rail, and when someone remarked that it seemed a strange choice, Eleanor only said that it seemed like precisely the right one. He rebuilt the barn properly that spring, top to bottom, sound in every joint, and wrote, for the first time in 18 months, a letter to Robert Ames in Missouri. Not an apology exactly, since some debts aren't canceled that easily, but an accounting, honest and complete, of what had happened and what he'd carried since. Robert wrote back 3 weeks later, shorter than Silas expected, saying only that he'd wondered for a long time what became of him, and that he was glad, at least, that Silas had finally stopped running. The fence around the Hargrove land held through every winter that followed, not because it never broke, but because there was always, from that October forward, someone willing to walk the line and fix whichever section needed it. That's the story tonight. A woman who told a stranger the truth about herself before she told him anything else. A man who'd spent 18 months building things for people who'd never remember his name until he found someone worth the risk of being remembered by. Neither of them fixed all at once. Both of them fixed anyway. One post, one wall, one honest evening at a time. Thank you for spending this one with us. If Silas and Eleanor found a place in your evening, there's more waiting here whenever you're ready. Until next time, go easy on whatever in your own life is falling apart. Most things worth keeping are.